Hiya! This week's Parsha is Parshat Pinchas. I've entitled the discussion, Passion and Compassion Properly Channeled. As we go through this, I would like you to think about Pinchas, Matot, and Basai, the last three Parshat of Sefer Bamidbar, as a unit, because we're going to see a lot of symmetry and a lot of interfacing between those three Parshiot over the next 3 weeks. So here we go. We're in the midst of Sefer Bamidbar. We engage with the telling of the big story of Jewish people in the Midbar, in the desert. There are so many twists and turns and dynamics in this complicated and multifaceted narrative. It also points to individual people and their own experiences, just as we did in Sefer Bereshit. We know that individual stories are often the best and most compelling way to learn about the larger picture, without becoming lost in the weeds. It is here in our study of individual narratives and their lessons that we can more accurately address the largesse of the big story that may elude or overwhelm us otherwise, while developing personal connections to its big lessons through the people that endure the various sets of circumstances. This week we will focus on Pinchas, after whom the Parsha is named, and due to his initiatives, God reconsiders what to do, and later Benot Tzlachad, in whose merit laws are stipulated by God in the Torah are changed. In both cases, contrary to other actions that we have seen and other people who have engaged in them, these actions are informed by passion to bring about changes that will show compassion. Let's begin where our Parsha begins, and God speaks to Moshe saying, Pinchas ben Eliezer ben Aharon HaKohen heshiv et chamatai me'al b'nei Yisrael et kinatai b'tocham v'lo kalishti et b'nei Yisrael b'kinatai. Pinchas, the son of Eliezer, the son of Aharon, the Kohen, has turned my anger away from the children of Israel by his zealousness in stating my case, so I did not destroy the children of Israel in spite of my feelings. Rashi comments that God is saying here, I was angry and I was prepared to release my wrath, but Pinchas changed the trajectory. I will suggest that here we see a human being taking on initiative that is difficult, given where the center of gravity is at this moment, as reflected in the rebellious actions amongst the Bnei Yisrael that we have witnessed. Moshe has done this at many pivotal points, and here we see Pinchas reacting in the same way, interceding on behalf of the people and trying to recalibrate where the relationship is between and by God and the Bnei Yisrael at this juncture. The next pasuk, therefore I say, Hineni noten lo et brit shalom. Give him briti shalom, my covenant of peace. That it should be a covenant of peace. No, there is not peace amongst the Bnei Yisrael, but Pinchas understands what peace is, according to Rashi. So God is stating that God will give Pinchas these feelings of peace. I'm looking at this and I'm saying Briti Shalom is really a show of gratitude from God. That in spite of everything that's going on, Pinchas is still looking at the bigger picture and responding in terms of that bigger picture. This Briti Shalom, this covenant of peace from God, will be for Pinchas and his descendants as an eternal covenant of the priesthood, Brit Kunat Olam, because of the fact that Pinchas showed Pinchas' devotion to and understanding of God, atoning for what the children of Israel have done up to this point. So this eternal covenant is important because Rashi points out that while the covenant of Kahuna had already been given to Aharon and his sons, the reality is Pinchas was born before that and had never been properly anointed. So now Pinchas is not through in the kahuna merely through inheritance as the other Kohanim, but through action, which shows us that yes, Status does come through inheritance, but also has to be maintained through action, as we have said several times through the years. So we learn in Zvachim, in the Gemara, 101b, Lo nitkahon Pinchas ad shehargu lezimri. Pinchas does not attain the level of kahuna, of priesthood, until he kills Zimri. We're going to see in this parsha the concept of machloket l'shem hashamayim. Both Pinchas and the Benot Zlachad come to God out of respect, come to the people teaching respect of God, and understand where they fit in. And their agenda is clearly quite different from Korah, who looks at Moshe and Aaron and says, why aren't we all kings? Or why aren't we all priests? We're all a mamlecha kohanim. Why do you have more status than I do? So on one hand, this is a lesson of intentionality and proper pushback or conflict. But also, of course, it reflects a level of discomfort because what's involved is Pinchas gets his status after killing Zimri. And Zimri is the son of Salu, the chieftain of the Shimon, of the Bet Shimon, who had intimate relationships with Cosbi, the daughter of Zor. So Rashi teaches that this is unusual because we will state the name of someone to indicate honor, but here we are identifying Zimri in terms of being someone who is not worthy of honor, someone who has acted dishonorably. So I would like to put on the table that we should remember that our leaders and those vested with responsibility, for them, much more is expected. So that perhaps the reason Zimri is mentioned here is not just because of what he did wrong, which clearly is the case, but he was a leader. He was a person of repute that did this wrong. And when a leader does something wrong, as we know from our very practical everyday lives, it definitely has an impact on the masses. So for that reason, his name is mentioned. And from the Tanchuma, we learn that the mention of Zimri is to stand in distinction and in contrast to the mention of Pinchas, who is mentioned for good. This is what you do. Zimri, you do not do this. And we'll see the same thing in Jewish history. In the book of Kings, for example, it will repeatedly say, and he was as good and in God's eyes as David, or he was as bad as this one, Jeroboam, in God's eyes, and for reasons of idolatry. What we see here is the interfacing of zealous actions, supporting God in the case of Pinchas, and going against God in the case of Zimri. And of course, the Midianite woman is mentioned as well, and it talks about the paternal house and the people of Midian. And next week, when we in Parshat Matot, talk about our conflicted feelings of the battle with Midian, what's really important to remember is that Cosbi is not a singular incident, but rather Zimri as a leader is cited out, and there are other Bnei Yisrael. This cohabitation with the Midianite women was understood to be an ongoing problem. So this is important to note. We must understand that this incident with Zimri and Cosbi were not thought to be an isolated incident, but rather engaged in by the masses. And this leader involved in such activities would lead to more rampant disobedience as opposed to leading the way to fixing the problem he engages in and brings others into the aberrant activity. Again, something we absolutely understand, unfortunately, from our daily news feed of when leaders go astray, it gives permission to many others to do the same thing. This was a problem of the time, And it is reminiscent of a trope that is repeated in Shoftim often, which says, Bayamim hahem et melech b'Yisrael isha yashar b'eineh hayaseh. That at that time of the Shoftim, of the judges, there was not one king, there was not a centrality of power in the Bnei Yisrael, but everybody did whatever they wanted to. Everybody did what they thought was right in their own eyes. Our modern iteration of that is making Shabbos for themselves. This is often a problem, certainly seen in many of the narratives of Bamidbar, accentuating that this is a spiritual desert, which is much more formidable than the physical one. Here we see rampant disarray and lack of adherence to central authority and to God. Further, we will see this yet again this week in our Haftarah from Malachim 1. We will learn about Eliyahu HaNavi and his last appearance, who had always crusaded against idolatry, and he must resort to murder, as does Pinchas, to purge the worship of Baal from the Bnei Yisrael during the reign of Achav and his wife Izabel. While we bristle more than a bit at such stories for many reasons, we understand the sanctity of life, we do not want others to be killed. The question for Eliyahu, as it is for Pinchas and so many others, is how do we maintain the integrity and purity of the Bnei Yisrael, while they are so subjected to and vulnerable to the ways of others? Remember, we always live among others, but how do we not replicate their ways and become corrupted by certain practices? There's no easy answer. For this reason, Pinchas does what is needed to be done according to many. And one thought is that while we mourn the death of others, we should also consider how we engage with those around us and not compromise who we are. Perhaps this is the lesson on which we should focus, that the passion for what was correct and the initiative of Pinchas brought about the compassion of God. But of course, we always have to ask, how long do these moments of regret and self-accountability last, given our human nature? How do we understand these difficult situations and those who resolve them in ways where we cannot achieve a win-win, but rather it is to someone's detriment, which may unfortunately be unavoidable? Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, Zichrono L'Shalom, taught as follows 2 years ago, as the pandemic, which changed the world as we know it, was in its beginning stages. He says, the coronavirus pandemic raised a series of deep moral and political issues. How far should government go in seeking to prevent its spread? To what extent should it restrict people's movements at the cost of violating their civil liberties? How far should it go in imposing a clampdown of businesses at the cost of driving too many people bankrupt, rendering swaths of the population unemployed, building up a mountain of debt for the future and plunging the economy into the worst recession since the 1930s? These are just a few of the many heartbreaking dilemmas that the pandemic forced upon governments and ourselves. Strikingly, almost every country adopted the same measures: social distancing, lockdown, until the incidence of new cases had reached its peak. Sweden was the most conspicuous exception. Nations did not count the cost. Virtually anonymously, they placed the saving of life above all other considerations. The economy may suffer, but life is infinitely precious, and saving it takes precedence over all else. Now, the problem in our situation is, do you kill this one over here to save these lives over here? And that's, of course, a dilemma that persists until today. Now, looking back 2.5 years into the impact of this reality, do we feel the same way? While being the Monday morning quarterback and considering other alternatives, we must recognize that these difficult situations do not find resolution without some cost, somehow, and to some people. That is reality. Within this difficult quagmire, note what we read regarding the praise of this difficult situation in Tehillim, chapter 106. V'yamod Pinchas v'yipalel v'tatzor magefa. Dechashova l'tzedakah lidor v'dor ad olam. Pinchas stepped forth and intervened. The plague ceased. The plague of disrespect, the plague of destruction, the plague of so much. It was reckoned to his merit for all generations, to eternity. At this moment of healing in our Parsha, we now learn about the population yet again and address the size of the tribes, those whose legacies we acknowledge, as well as the allotment of land, which will correlate with the size of the various Shvatim, tribes. It is in this context that we come to our second narrative on which we will focus this week, that of Benot Tzlachad in Perek Chav Zayin. Vatikravna Benot Tzlachad ben Chefer ben Gilad ben Mekir ben Menashe lemishpachot Menashe ben Yosef ve'ele shmot benotav Machla Noah Chagla Milka v'Tirza. The daughters of Tzlachad, the son of Chefer, the son of Gilad, the son of Machir, the son of Menashe, the families of Menashe, of Yosef, come forward. And we name these daughters. Remember what we said about naming. Machla, Noah, Chogla, Milka, Tirza. What we see here is again the intersection of conflicting issues. Nothing is seen in isolation. Why is this said? Why is this entire trajectory given? To inform you that we go back to Yosef, who loves the land, who is dedicated to Eretz Yisrael. And this Yerusha, this sense of inheritance, is passed down generation to generation to generation, from Yosef to Menashe to Mechir to Gilad to Hefner. And it is this Yerusha, it is this reason that the Benot Tzlachad come and say, give us a portion. We must have some of this land. At this point of interest, I would say, in the laws of Shmirat HaLashon, that we are not to repeat such legacies if they are for dishonor, noting the historical context we have earlier regarding Zimri, here we are stating it for honor. So we're learning a lot about legacy, how much we say. If you just compare how Pinchas is presented, how Zimri is presented, how Cosbi is presented, and then the Benot Tzlachad. So the daughters of Tzlachad stand before Moshe and before Eliezer HaKohen and before the chieftains and the entire congregation, and they say, Avinu met b'midbar, our father died in the desert, but he was not part of the assembly that banded together against God. Rather, in other words, he was not part of Korach's group. But Chato met. He died because of a personal sin, a personal avera, and did not have sons. He died of his own personal sin and did not have sons. Because we are so close to the rebellion of Korach, and we've read about other rebellions, it's important to note that this man was not part of that. Therefore, he died for his own sin, and he did not, like others that we've mentioned, cause others to sin with him, according to Baba Batra, 18b. Tzlachad does do a misstep, and some suggest that it was he who was carrying the wood on Shabbat. But it is important that this was private and individual, not public, not through a leader, not encouraging others to do the same, as is in the case of Korach and others. So they come and they say, the daughters of Tzlachad, why should our father's name be eliminated from the family just because he had no son? Give us a portion with our father's brothers. So, ki ein lo ben, he didn't have a son. So we are standing bimkom. We are standing, and this is a halachic principle. If it cannot be the ideal, then what is bimkom? Ideally, people should be right-handed, but if you are left-handed, as am I, and a sizable portion of the population, your left hand, for example, in putting on tefillin, is seen as bimkom. So your left hand becomes your strong arm, your right hand becomes your weak arm, and you put tefillin on the right. Bimkom is a very interesting principle that allows for some halachic adjustments. And that is what we are going to see here. If they had had a son, the suggestion here, they would not have made a claim, because then they would have married men, they would have gone to their land, which was the way that society maintained its order, notwithstanding present sensibilities. That was the way it was done. So what this is suggesting is this teaches us that they were, in fact, intelligent women. Magin shehakmaniyot hayu, according to Sifrei Pinchas. Moses brings their case before God. Vayikrav Moshe et mishpatan lifnei Hashem. The law eluded him. He didn't know what to do. Because remember, Moshe, God says, Moshe does. God says, Moshe does. God said, Moshe does. God didn't say here. Moshe's not going to make it up along the way on his own. So we learn here that Zlafchad's daughters were meritorious to the point that law was going to be made here in their merit. And we're going to see this repeated at the end of Sefer Bamidbar, which we will talk about why the repetition at that point and why that is the last scenario of Sefer Bamidbar. So let's note here the difference between Moshe not knowing, Vayikrav Moshe et mishpatan lifnei Hashem, and the statement halacha leMoshe miSinai. There are many things we do, there are many things that have become part of our lives, where we learn it was halacha that was given to Moshe at Sinai. But this was not given to Moshe at Sinai, so Moshe has to go through this process, a proper process, and God is going to make an adjustment in the law at this point. God speaks to Moshe saying, Ken benot zlavchad zibrot noten titen lahem achuzat nachala b'toch avim. The benot zlavchad are speaking properly. Give them the Yerusha, the inheritance that would go to the sons, had there been a son, in their place. God sees that things do not always work out the way they're supposed to. And when things do not work out the way they're supposed to, we have to make adjustments. But we have to make adjustments in the proper way that will maintain the spirit and the purpose of the original law. So God says, yes, according to Rashi and Sifrei Pinchas, their claim is just. Fortunate is the person with whose word the Holy One, blessed be God, concurs. Yafet havu ashrei adam shakadosh baruch hu model l'divarav. God agrees with the ladies. You should give them the land, both the portion that was their father's, who was among those who experienced Yetziat Mitzrayim, and the portion which he shared with his brothers in the property of Hefer. Note what happens here. A whole set of laws is now going to be given as a result of this properly processed request. And in verse 8, we see, speak to the children of Israel, saying, if a man dies, ish ki yamut, uven ein lo, v'avartam en achalato lebito. A man dies, he does not have a son. His Yerusha, his inheritance, goes as his nachala, the land that he inherits, goes to his daughter. And then it continues, if he has no daughter, you give it to his brothers. And if he has no brothers, you give it to his father's brothers. And if his father has no brothers, you give over to the closest in his family. In the Gemara, in Baba Batra 119b, we learn, Tana benot zlavchad chachmanioten, darshanioten, tzidkanioten. The daughters of Zlavchad are wise. They are interpreters of verses, and they are righteous. How did they know to do this? How did they know how to approach God, what to invoke in approaching God, and to get this result that was going to be given to them? The Gemara says, yes, they are wise because they spoke in accordance with the moment. They spoke to a situation that was imminent. They presented their case at the correct time. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yitzchak says, tradition teaches that Moshe, our teacher, was sitting and interpreting in the Torah portions about men whose married brothers had died childless. This is the case of the Yavamah, as it states, if brothers dwell together. And it is in the context of this law that is based on the situational circumstances of the woman that these adjustments are made. Once again, the point that any one person cannot possibly have the entirety of the picture of who we are in front of him is reinforced. Even in this case, it is important to note that that person is none other than Moshe Rabbeinu, who goes to God to resolve this. It must be noted that later in this parsha, Moshe is informed that he will not lead the Bnei Yisrael into Eretz Yisrael, and is given very clear instructions regarding his successor. Some may see this as the greatest injustice of all, namely, that the leader who has done so much will not be part of the ultimate goal and its experience. However, one can make the point that God is showing compassion once again, as Moshe's passion may be waning. Exhaustion sets in given our human limitations in spite of the most noble of efforts. And perhaps there is as much to learn from Moshe's limits, whether we go with the hitting of the stone or whatever reason we want to give, as there is from all of Moshe's accomplishments. We should remember the accomplishments and not the missteps. That's always a fear, right? Somebody has a reputation and then does something wrong, and the fear is that every positive thing that they did will not be remembered, but the wrongdoing will be remembered. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to engage in that process. The parsha will end with instructions regarding the sacrifices, the korbanot, that are attached to each of our annual celebrations and observances. We know this part of the Torah well, as we read the appropriate portions on these special days, both in the Amidah and as the additional Torah reading, and in addition to the normative cycle of readings. You will note when you are in shul and you hear this parsha and the end of this parsha that, oh yes, I know that paragraph from Pesach. I know that paragraph from Sukkot. I know that paragraph. You'll say it on Shabbat, later in the Amidah. It is about remembering, if not restoring, this aspect of our Jewish communal practice. In other words, through all these stories of trauma and change and everything else in the personal stories, we also have to balance it with remembering the collective. As we say the words, we are to channel the passion of the practice and those that engaged with it. In this way, by remembering our passion to do what is right, we will hopefully evoke God's compassion. This is an important lesson of this parsha, and in the name of the person for whom it is named, Parshat Pinchas. L'hitrat b'shavua haba, Shabbat Shalom likulam, and I wish you all a meaningful and reflective 3 weeks as we think about ourselves, our community, God, and everything that we are. L'hitraot.